Imagine the coldest night you have ever felt, the kind of cold that gets inside your bones and doesn't leave. Now imagine that cold lasting not one night, not one winter, but 20,000 years. That is what your ancestors survived. And what happened after, what those humans did when the ice finally retreated, is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire history of this planet. It is the story of how a small, desperate band of survivors became the dominant species on Earth. It is the story of how everything you know, your cities, your food, your language, your wars, your art, grew directly out of the wreckage of one of the most brutal climate events in human history. This is what happened to the humans who survived the Ice Age. First, understand what the Ice Age actually was. Scientists call it the Last Glacial Maximum. It peaked roughly 22,000 years ago. At that point, massive sheets of ice, some stretching 3 kilometers thick, covered most of North America, Northern Europe, and large parts of Asia. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. Entire coastlines that humans had lived on for generations were buried under glaciers or swallowed by shifting seas. The land that is now the English Channel was dry. The land connecting Asia to North America, what we now call Beringia, was a vast open plain where people walked freely between continents. The world was unrecognizable, and living inside it were modern humans, not primitive creatures, not half-evolved ancestors. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens with brains identical to yours, trying to stay alive in a landscape that was doing everything it could to kill them. Archaeologist Brian Fagan spent decades studying this period and described the Ice Age humans as the ultimate survivors. They did not have agriculture. They did not have permanent settlements. They did not have writing or metal or wheels. What they had was each other, their intelligence, and a relentless drive to adapt. They followed herds of woolly mammoths and reindeer across frozen plains. They built shelters from mammoth bones. When there was no wood, they sewed animal skins together with bone needles, a technology so precise and effective that versions of it are still used today. They painted the walls of caves in southern France and northern Spain, Lascaux, Altamira, with images of such beauty and complexity that when modern Europeans first discovered them in the 19th century, they refused to believe primitive humans could have made them. But they did, because they were not primitive. They were brilliant, they were desperate, and they were surviving. Then, around 15,000 years ago, something shifted. The ice began to melt. It did not happen overnight. Climate scientist William Rudiman has documented the gradual, grinding nature of this transition, temperatures rising by fractions of a degree over centuries, glaciers retreating millimeter by millimeter, then meter by meter, then kilometer by kilometer. For the humans living through it, the change must have been almost imperceptible at first, but the land was transforming beneath their feet. Coastlines that had been frozen tundra became temperate forests. Rivers that had been locked under ice began to flow again. The great herds of megafauna, the woolly mammoths, the cave lions, the giant ground sloths, began to disappear. Some were killed off by the changing climate. Others were hunted to extinction by the very humans whose survival had once depended on them. And the people who had built their entire way of life around following those herds were suddenly faced with a world that no longer worked the way they knew. This is the moment everything changed, because what the survivors did next was not retreat. It was not collapse. What they did was adapt, on a scale so rapid and so total that archaeologists call it the most important transition in human history. They stopped moving. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors had been nomads. Movement was survival. Staying in one place meant exhausting your resources and dying. But as the ice retreated and new landscapes emerged, particularly in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, stretching across parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Israel, something extraordinary happened. Plants that humans had been gathering for millennia began to grow in dense, reliable patches. Wild wheat, wild barley, wild legumes. And the humans who lived near these patches made a discovery that would change the world forever. You could stay. Anthropologist David Graeber argued that this transition, from nomadic forager to settled farmer, was not the obvious step forward that we assume it was. The first farmers actually worked harder than their nomadic ancestors. They were more vulnerable to famine when harvests failed. They were more susceptible to disease because they lived in close proximity to animals and to each other. The skeletal remains of early farmers show more signs of malnutrition, more dental decay, more physical stress than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. And yet they stayed. They planted. They built walls. They dug irrigation channels. They domesticated animals, first dogs, then goats, then sheep, then cattle. They created surplus food, which meant some people no longer had to farm, which meant specialization, which meant craft, trade, hierarchy, governance, religion, writing. Everything followed from that one decision made by Ice Age survivors standing in a warming landscape, looking at a patch of wild grain, and choosing to stay. The oldest known settlement in the world, Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, was built approximately 11,000 years ago by people who were still transitioning from hunter-gatherer life to settled existence. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the invention of writing, and it is not a simple shelter or a storage facility. It is a temple, a place of ritual, of gathering, of meaning. built by people who had just come through the end of the Ice Age and were already asking the questions that define us as a species. Who are we? Why are we here? What do we owe each other? The Ice Age did not break humanity, it forged it, because here is what the survivors carried with them out of those 20,000 years of cold and darkness. They carried adaptability. The humans who made it through the last glacial maximum were the ones who could solve problems faster than the environment could create them. They were the ones who cooperated across groups when resources were scarce. They were the ones who passed knowledge down through generations, through story, through ritual, through art, so that each generation started slightly further ahead than the last. That is your inheritance, not the cold, not the struggle, but the cognitive and social tools those survivors developed to stay alive inside it. Every time your brain solves a problem under pressure, it is running the same software your ancestors ran, standing on a frozen plain, with nothing but their intelligence and each other. Every time a community comes together in a crisis, it is echoing the cooperation that kept small bands of Ice Age humans alive through winters that lasted decades. Every city on Earth, every field of wheat, every hospital, every school, all of it traces a direct line back to a small group of survivors who came out the other side of the ice and decided to build something that would last. The ice retreated, the humans remained, and standing in the warmth of a world reborn, your ancestors looked at the open land before them, at the rivers beginning to flow, at the animals emerging from retreating glaciers, at the seeds pushing up through soil that had been frozen for 20,000 years, and they got to work, just like they always had.